Hi, my name is Mita Williams, and this is my Jane's Walk. I couldn't resist submitting a silly title, so today's tour is officially called The Electric Slide Deck, but you can call it by its working title, which is a virtual tour of Windsor's electrical grid. Now, before we start, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I am not an expert in matters of electricity. I'm not a certified electrician. I'm not an engineer. But I do know how to research, and I have some experience in organizing information for better general understanding. So while I sincerely hope that I'm presenting information that is up to date and accurate, there could be mistakes in this presentation. If you see an error, please let me know in the comments, and I will put the corrections in the live version of these slides. Now, you may be wondering, why did I prepare a virtual tour of the Windsor electrical grid for this walk festival, Jane's Walk Festival? And so before I start, let me quickly answer with 2 out of the 3 reasons why I'm doing this. And I'll share my last reason at the end of the tour. The first reason is very simple. I made this tour because I was curious about our electrical grid, and I was looking for an excuse to learn more about it. And when I was doing the research, I couldn't find a single source of information that brought together all the parts of our local electrical grid together in a way that could be understood by most people. And so I created my own introduction, which I'm sharing with you today. And the second reason why I'm doing this particular tour is that because this year, all Jane's Walks again are virtual and digital. Now, since this particular tour is going to take us all around the city, it would have taken much too long if we had done this by foot. And so I'm going to go as far as to say that I think this particular Jane's Walk is actually better suited to be done virtually through photos and maps. So speaking of which, let's start with the map. So my talk or tour is a tour of our electrical grid. And before we start, I should probably explain what I mean by that. You can think of an electrical grid as one massive interconnected machine that generates electricity and transports that electricity to where it's consumed. This is a map of the 4 major electrical grids of North America. The Western grid, the Texas grid, which we remember failed terribly this past February, the Quebec grid, and the Eastern grid, of which, of course, Windsor, Ontario is a part. Now, our grid, or at least our provincial grid, is connected over 26 grid interties with 2 provinces, Quebec and Manitoba, and 3 states, Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. Now, we can understand the electrical grid in different ways using different approaches. We could, for example, try to understand our electrical grid by learning about the physics and engineering that make up these systems. Or we could look at our local systems with more of a historical lens and mark how and when our electrical grid grew over the years. Or we could look at the electrical systems and talk about how the energy policies that influenced how our grid was developed. But that's not what we're going to do today on today's tour. We're not going to talk about how electricity is generated. We're not going to discuss the origins of and history of Ontario Hydro. And we're certainly not going to get into the politics behind energy and energy prices. Instead, we are just going to try to understand our electrical grid better, largely through maps. When we can, I will try to point out its physical infrastructure that we can see right within our city, and make note of where it is and what to look for. Hopefully by the end of the tour, you'll be able to recognize the electrical infrastructure that connects our homes and delivers us the power that we use every day. That being said, it is useful to know that the grid is built and maintained by a vast collection of different public, crown, and private corporations that manage the generation, the transmission, and the consumption of energy. I'm not going to introduce you to all the players, but just some of the local ones. So, as you can see in the bottom of this map, in Essex County, there are 3 local electrical distribution companies. There is ELK Energy, which serves Essex, Lakeshore, and Kingsville. Essex Powerline, which services Amherstburg, LaSalle, Leamington, and Tecumseh, and N1 Utilities Limited, which services the city of Windsor. Now we're going to start our tour by first finding and identifying all the major electrical power generators in the city of Windsor, largely again through this map provided by the IESO. Now you may be like me just mere weeks ago and not have realized that our city actually contains 4 gas-powered electrical plants that generate electricity within Windsor-Essex. In fact, actually, there's more than that. These 4 are only the ones that have the capacity to generate over 20 megawatts and are connected to the high-voltage transmission grid. So, where are these electrical power plants of Windsor, Ontario? Well, these are the 5 largest sources that we found on that map of local electricity. There's the Brighton Beach, which is by far the largest, of 520 megawatts, and that came online in 2004. We have West Windsor Power, East Windsor Cogen, Trans-Alta Windsor, and Windsor Solar, which was the last to come online in 2016. Now, the first 4 of these are natural gas-powered cogeneration plants. I'm not going to talk again as much about the engineering, but just know that cogeneration plants generate electricity, and then they take the otherwise wasted heat from the generation of electricity, and then they use that to generate more electricity. Okay, so knowing that, let's start our tour. So the Brighton Beach Generation Station is located in the west end of our city on the shores of the Detroit River, just across from Zug Island, as you can see from this split screen of Google Maps and Google Street View. According to Wikipedia, the Brighton Beach Station has the 5th highest generation capacity in Ontario for gas-powered plants. As you can tell from this particular view, it's not that easy to see very much of it from the street, since this is Google Street View. And it's not particularly easy for non-employees to get closer. However, through the power, I believe, if it was Apple Maps, I have this image. So you can see the sort of the 2 towers and the 2 cooling stations or generating stations of Brighton Beach. However, I want to bring your attention to the Google satellite imagery, where we can see this view of Brighton Beach in a pretty extraordinary way, I like to think. This allows us, this sort of Google Earth view, allows us not only to see Brighton Beach located in orientation to the city of Windsor, but we can see how it is situated across from Detroit. And we can see a treed area. It's not labeled as such here, but that treed area is connected to the Black Oak Heritage Park. And if you can see, it's a little tricky, but there's a little bit of gray text on a gray background. Beside Brighton Beach is something known as the J.C. Keith Transformer Station. It's a little bit, I've changed the angle on this particular view. So you can see the Brighton Beach generating station, and beside it, the J.C. Keith. Now, the J.C. Keith Transformer Station was located on the site of the former J. Clark Keith generating station, which opened in 1953. It ceased operations in 1984, and it was demolished in 1997. I think it was after a fire. I was very curious who this J.C. Clark was, and I did some research. J. Clark Keith was the general manager of the Windsor Utilities Commission, and he was a man of some influence in his day. From this picture, which I found via Maclean's, a scan of Maclean's from May 1st of 1940, we can see that J. Clark Keith is the gentleman on the far right. Now, just behind the Brighton Beach generating station is another smaller station called West Windsor Power. Sorry, I was going to call it Windsor West. Here is a better view that shows how close this particular plant is to Brighton Beach, and how close it is, of course, to the JC Transformer Station. Now, Again, by the way, if you have not had a chance to explore the sort of 3D Earth view of the Google Maps the satellite view and the 3D view, I strongly recommend it. It's just really extraordinary ways of looking at our city. So West Windsor Power is a plant. It's operated by a company called NG North America. They do actually have their own website, but that site is clearly oriented mostly for safety orientation for visiting contractors. That being said, one thing that I did learn about Windsor West is that according to this 2014 document from the IESO, West Windsor Power is a certified black start generator. A black start generator is a unit that can start up from its own power without needing support from the grid itself in case of a major system collapse or a system-wide blackout. This means that when the grid goes down, it's a plant that is able to generate the electricity necessary to help start and maintain the machine known as the grid that helps us produce our electricity across the province. So as I mentioned before, we do have not only a west plant, but we have an East Windsor Cogen plant. And if we follow the Detroit River, we can find it. In fact, just across from the former Our Lady of Rosary Church, now known as the Water Edge Event Center, and located, I think, right on or adjacent to the industrial lands of the Ford Motor Company Canada. I don't really have a particularly fun fact about this particular plant. All I could find out was that it does also have the capability to provide steam for Ford Motor. So again, steam is a component of these sort of cogeneration plants. Here's a fact sheet that is found, is also known as the Capital Power Cogeneration Center. Now, the next power plant on our tour is known as the Trans-Alta Windsor plant, and this one was really hard for me to track down. When I tried to look for this particular plant was located, all I could find out that it was south of Chrysler's. So all I can say is that I'm only pretty sure that this is the Trans-Alta Windsor plant. You can see some of the sort of distinctive twin features that we've recognized in the other images. And also there is the telltale signs of some sort of transformer or electrical substation beside it. So I'm pretty sure this is the Trans-Alta plant. Speaking of substations, one of the things that I was really hoping to do on this tour was to provide at least a map or even a sort of visual tour of the major sort of substations of our area. But I found that without having any public addresses, or signage, it was near impossible for me to determine exactly what stations were what when I stumbled upon them in the Google Earth view. It's just something that I find is absolutely fascinating. These are really large bits, large collections of infrastructure, but without an address and without signage, it's still really hard for me, and I still couldn't find many of these transformer stations. They're also known as substations. By the way, substations, sometimes they're also known as transmission stations or transformer stations, collection stations. All of these exist to connect and direct the electrical grid. Sometimes substations collect electricity, like when they're connected to a solar farm. Sometimes they are switching stations, and they exist to essentially move larger voltages of electricity across a wider area. Sometimes they exist to boost up the voltage so that electricity can travel, and sometimes they exist to step down the level of voltage from higher to lower as it passes into like a local area of distribution. Now, speaking of solar farms, did you know that we had a solar farm in the boundaries of the city of Windsor? I knew that, but it was funny that I had never been able to see it. And the reason why I'd never been able to see it until now was that even though I knew it was located at the Windsor airport, it's difficult to see from when you're driving a car. However, if you use Apple Maps, oddly enough, this doesn't work with Google Maps, but you can see that there are clearly delineated solar panels in between the runways of the Windsor Airport. Now, again, these are not the only power plants in the city. Let me remind you that the University of Windsor, for example, has its own energy conversion center. Evidently, it can produce up to 4 megawatts of electricity. Evidently, Hiram Walker produces 95% of their own electricity. And so, especially in the auto industries, there are probably other sources, places that they supplement some of their own electrical generation in-house. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that even though we have local generators in the area, they may not be running. In fact, if you check GridWatch right now, and the link is there, you may find that none of them might even be running at the moment. You see, our demand for electricity fluctuates with the seasons, and so our grid must have a capacity of being able to handle both sort of a minimal load and a maximal load. And in the springtime, it looks like that's where the peak electricity, this is sort of the trough of electricity, I guess, is the opposite of a peak. There's at least the less electricity that's being used. In the summer months, when people are using air conditioning, and in the winter months, those are the times of peak energy, peak electrical consumption in the province of Ontario. The other thing I want to just bring to your attention is how much of Ontario's electricity is generated by nuclear power, hydropower, and then following that is wind and then natural gas. Now, as you can see from this particular national breakdown of electrical power sources, you can see that many provinces have very different mixes of how they generate electricity. You can see that in Ontario, our use is substantially done by nuclear, whereas in Manitoba and Quebec, those are primarily generated by water, or, as we know now, hydro. And that brings us to our transmission section of our tour. So transmission is the part of the electrical grid that brings the electricity generated by power plants to our homes and businesses via power plants, and evidently sort of the power lines that we call them, evidently in the industry, they are also known as conductors. Now, I'd mentioned earlier in this tour, there are substations or transformer stations. They exist to boost up electricity, to force it to travel long distances in a sort of efficient manner. And then when it gets near to its destination, it helps step down or reduce the voltage of electricity to levels that better suit our commercial and residential needs. Now, again, we're not going to talk about the sort of the fundamentals of the physics and the chemistry and the engineering of the electrical systems, but if you would like to know a little bit more, I strongly recommend this particular video from Practical Engineering for a good explainer. I will say that for the purposes of our tour, I do want to share 3 things for you to keep in mind next time you look at a transmission tower, otherwise known as a pylon, as you can see on the screen. So first, electricity is generally made available in 3 phases, and this is why the transmission lines or conductors of these large transmission towers generally are grouped in groups of 3. Now, the bigger the tower, the more powerful the voltage of the line. And these power lines are not insulated at all. In fact, the only insulation that they have generally is sort of the air around them. And so they are indeed super dangerous, and that is one of the reasons why they are kept so high in the air, away from people as much as possible. Now, this is a map of the high voltage grid as it travels into southwestern Ontario and into Essex County. It's a little difficult to see, but there are three types of high voltage lines. We don't have the very highest 500 kilovolt lines, but we do have we have two sets. We have in light blue, the 230 kilowatt lines, and in the gray, 115 kilowatt lines. And sometimes they're running in parallel. I should also note that there is going to be a new power line that is currently proposed for Essex County. Just know that any of the maps that I'm going to show you will feature this proposed line. In fact, I'm not entirely sure where it is. I haven't found a really great map for it as of yet. But I did find this map. This is a map of these high voltage lines and what they call, and the stations that go with them. And so as you can see, it looks like a lot of the power lines tend to follow sort of major highway systems. And so you can see here how our systems connect largely at Chatham, and then where they're branched up to Lambton and towards London, Ontario. Now, if we zoom in a little bit more, we can see to just Essex County, we can see even more detail. So we can see those high voltage 230 kilovolt lines, how they run across the county, and then they connect to the J.C. Keith transfer station and beyond to Michigan. We can see that Kingsville and Leamington have high-powered power lines that end in nearby transformer stations. And it's a little confusing with this map, but you can see that if you look at where downtown Windsor is, you'll see that there are no major power lines above ground, but there are a significant amount of underground cable, and where there are a number of transformer stations. Now, there are also a lot of little strange codes, and I would just want to bring your attention to it because I figured out what they are. I'm very pleased to say and delighted to report that these are names of circuits. So here's, for example, a fact sheet of our East Windsor Cogen station or center, which we know now is on the east side of the city. And at the very bottom, you can say that this, under quick facts, that this plant has an interconnection at the Hydro 1 115 kilovolt circuit E8F and 9E9F, which was available in the map previously. I don't know about you, but the fact that such a massive electrical structure that we have that crosses not just our county, but our province, can be reduced almost to understanding it as another form of circuit is just absolutely fascinating to me, and I think it just blows our mind. You can see now, hopefully you can recognize some of the features in this abstraction of the Windsor-Essex regional infrastructure. If you look carefully at the very left of the page, you can see we have the West Windsor generating stations. We can see there's the Brighton Beach cogeneration stations. We can see that they are connected to the Keith transfer station, and how there have different substations where they are connected to the Trans-Alta and other generation stations that are outside of the city. And that brings us to consumption. And which is literally the time where we bring the chore home and we connect these larger systems with the places where we live and to the outlets that give us power. And as we mentioned from the beginning of the tour, our electricity is delivered to us via Enwin Utilities Limited. So Enwin Utilities is wholly owned by Windsor Canada Utilities Limited, which itself is wholly owned by the city of Windsor. If you ask me why the NWIN is structured this way, I honestly cannot tell you the answer. Now, I can tell you that the assets of NWIN utilities are really fascinating. Again, they refer to all the sort of power lines in their city as sort of circuitry, which I think is amazing. There are over 670 kilometers of overhead primary circuitry and a significant amount of underground primary circuitry, as we know from the maps that we've seen before. There are transformer stations, there are distribution transformers, and there are station transformers and feeders. Not something I know where they exist. Again, it's very difficult to find things when we don't have an address. This information was taken from the NWIN annual report from 2019. One of the most curious aspects I find of the NWIN website is that if you actually want to read this report, this annual report, you actually have to email the president and CEO directly, and the CEO will send you a copy. When I asked why this was the case, I was told that it was deemed too costly for NWIN to meet the Accessibilities for Ontarians with Disabilities Act compliance requirements for complex documents that are placed on their website, so they made the documents available on request only. So, as an editorial aside, I find this an extraordinary claim from an organization that has like an annual revenue of over $300 million a year, that pays the city of Windsor a $4 million dividend every year, and to say that it is too expensive is extraordinary. I think as the primary stakeholders of NWIN, being the city of Windsor, I do think we deserve better. Again, NWIN is not only owned by the city of Windsor. Our mayor is the chair of the NWIN board. We have 3 city councilors who sit on the board. I really do think that that information should be more readily available to the residents of Windsor. Now, that being said, I'm very aware that most residents probably don't think of NWIN unless they are looking at their utility bill, or unless they are dealing with a local outage. If you aren't already aware, NWIN offers a dynamic outage map that is also allows for alerts that are, if you're connected to Twitter, if you suddenly find yourself working on battery power. I also, in digging around the NWIN site, I did find this interesting map of NWIN capital projects, or as I call them, hydro construction projects. If you are interested in which utility poles are going to be shortly replaced, this is an interesting dynamic map. Now, that being said, I found some really great information not on NWIN's site. I did find Hydro-Quebec had some really great explainers that explained, at least to me and my understanding, of how to make sense of the wires or conductors or circuitry that exist outside of, in the laneway of my outside of our house and connects. And one of the things I'm really so glad about this tour was it gave me an excuse to finally spend some time and try to decipher what all those wires mean. So speaking of utility pools, I now know that this large utility pole that's in the back, you can see at the very top, that has the high voltage, and it is connected to a fuse, which is good to know because that fuse will protect the rest of the system in case like a tree falls on the line and it shorts the circuit and it overheats. That fuse will break and protect the rest of the line. I'm also further down the pole. I now know that inside that weird bucket is a transformer, and that exists so that it can take the high voltage at the top of the lines of the top and bring it down to lower voltage lines. And those lines eventually get, as you can see, the diagonal line does come and connect to my house. There is some weird sort of like ceramic discs there. I'm not sure what those are, the lightning arrestor or bushing, but I did learn that one of the reasons why they're shaped that way is that that sort of insulation is looks like little little discs to prevent water from pooling in a way that may make water accidentally end up as a conductor. So I thought that was really neat. So the electrical wires from the pole in the backyard now connects to our house on our second floor via a service entrance point. Hopefully and presumably those wires continue to the service or distribution panel, which in our house is in the basement. We like to call it the fuse box. You probably call yours that as well. And then that electricity is distributed and made available through the house via outlets, just like the one that my laptop is currently plugged into. And so, dear listener, this takes us to the end of our Drains Walk. We went from generation to transmission to consumption. Now, I did promise at the beginning of our tour that I would, at the end, share with you my third reason why I wanted to give this tour of the Windsor electrical grid to you, my neighbors, and fellow residents. And that reason's both simple and complex. I'm deeply concerned about climate change, like many, many others, and I believe that we need massive change at every level of society in order to bring down the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases to better stabilize our world for our children and their children. Now, in order to bring around that change, we need to stop thinking of ourselves as just consumers of electricity. We need to think of ourselves as producers, as distributors, as investors, as maintainers, and as stewards. So I hope this tour has given you a better understanding and appreciation of the electrical grid and the systems that keep our lights on. And I want to thank all the people who are involved in helping keep our lights on in a safe and efficient manner. And before I go, I do want to extend my thanks to the organizer of the Windsor-Essex Drains Walk Festival for 2021, Sarah Morris. And thanks for making our city a better place to live. Thank you so much. And before you go, don't forget to smash that like button, ring that bell. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. I just always wanted to say that. Anyways, thank you. Bye-bye.